dying as a martyr is actually going to do far more.
The games are all about the Roman emperors giving the people what they need, and it's always described as bread and circuses. They had to feed the people of Rome, but once they were fed, they had to be entertained.
The arenas of ancient Rome were never satisfied with simple bloodshed. They craved excess, turning executions into theater and battles into nightmares.
The meridiani, this is when the executions of criminals condemned to death took place, in ways that were memorable.
Crowds screamed as men were burned alive, thrown to wild beasts in damnatio et bestias, or forced to fight as bestiarii.
Public executions were supposed to teach a lesson to those who witnessed them. The fate of Christians who persisted in their belief was a capital offense. It was a death penalty offense.
Others were dragged into staged naval battles that flooded entire arenas. And yet, the most shocking part is not what they did, but why they did it. The birth of gladiator bloodshed. The crowd that once gathered in Rome did not come for words or speeches.
The Colosseum in Rome is one of the most iconic structures in the history of humanity.
They came for the sight of men locked in combat, their survival measured by every drop of blood that hit the ground. But how did a ritual meant to honor the dead transform into the empire's most infamous form of entertainment? The story begins in 264 BC, at a funeral that would change Rome forever. Two brothers, Marcus and Decimus Junius Brutus, had just buried their father. To pay respect, they did what tradition demanded. They staged a munus, a duty owed to the deceased. Only this duty was unlike the solemn offerings Rome had known before. Instead of prayers, 3 pairs of gladiators fought with steel in the Forum Boarium. Their sacrifice was not for an audience, but for the soul of the man they buried. This act carried the weight of an older Campanian custom, one that demanded human blood at tombs. Yet something about this spectacle struck deeper than anyone expected. Other wealthy families noticed. Soon, what had been a family ritual began to spread across the Republic. By the end of the 3rd century BC, the practice was already shifting. It no longer belonged only to funerals. Now these combats appeared at festivals, woven into the ludi, the games the Senate used to honor the gods. During moments of crisis, leaders believed Rome's survival depended on divine favor. So they poured money into these events, hoping the gods would answer with protection. But did those watching believe it was only about religion anymore? Or had the appeal of violence itself begun to take hold? The wooden platforms set up in muddy forums soon gave way to structures designed to contain larger crowds. By the end of the Republic, stone amphitheaters replaced temporary arenas, and the people no longer had to wait for funerals or special ceremonies to see blood spilled. Rules began to take shape. Gladiators were armed with specialized weapons, trained for specific roles.
And the gladiator's oath binds together the trainer and the gladiator. For better or worse, they are in it together. This is like a macabre marriage oath. She is signing herself over, body and soul.
And matched to create dramatic clashes. What had once been a duty to the dead was now a state-funded performance. Each strike, each wound, was no longer just a ritual. It was a show meant to thrill the masses. And in this transformation, Rome revealed something unsettling about itself. Entertainment became inseparable from cruelty. What was once solemn devotion had turned into sanctioned violence, carried out under the gaze of thousands. The empire was not just writing laws on tablets anymore. It was carving its authority into stone amphitheaters, where human lives were reduced to fleeting moments of spectacle. The brutality of these games would only grow in the centuries that followed, but the roots were already planted. A ritual offering at a single funeral had opened the gates to one of history's most inhumane traditions, and Rome would never be the same again. Damnatio ad bestias.
And you look up at the imperial box, and there is Rome's emperor in the flesh with the power of life and death over you. Well, that must have been an overwhelming experience.
There was a moment when the bloodshed of gladiator combat no longer seemed enough for Rome's restless audiences. By the 2nd century BC, the games had taken on a darker edge, one that pushed human cruelty further than before. In the year 189 before Christ, a consul named Marcus Fulvius Nobilior decided to expand the spectacles. Gladiatorial duels had become familiar to the crowds, but he wanted something that would set his games apart. His answer was to pit men against wild beasts. On that day, lions and panthers were released into the arena to face human fighters. What had once been about courage between equals became an uneven struggle for survival. The Romans were not hunters by tradition. They usually killed animals only when their farms or families were threatened. But when the beasts were set loose against men in public, the crowd found the display thrilling. Nobilior had introduced the first official animal program, and the audience roared for more. This was a turning point. Until then, the expectation had been that death in the arena should carry a sense of fairness, some measure of honor in combat. Now, with starved cats tearing into terrified men, entertainment outweighed dignity. The laughter and chants from the crowd no longer supported the man fighting for his life.
The fight he records captures some of the contradictions of Rome. Its combatants are celebrated, but they are also enslaved.
They cheered instead for the jaws of the beasts to finish him. 2 decades later, in the year 167 BC, another Roman leader took this brutality even further. Aemilius Paulus staged what would be remembered as the first true damnatio ad bestias. His chosen victims were army deserters, men condemned for betrayal. They were brought into the public arena, but instead of swords or spears, their executioners were elephants. One by one, the deserters were crushed under the weight of the great animals as the crowd watched. Historians later explained why this form of spectacle gained such power. Garrett Fagan described how Romans felt satisfaction and relief when those beneath them were thrown to beasts. The act provided the masses with a sense of shared strength, as if watching another man's destruction somehow affirmed their own place in society. What had started with duels now crossed into pure degradation. Rome had reached the point where the value of human life meant little compared to the thrill of watching it destroyed in the sand. The brutal world of the Roman bestiarii. Rome's arenas were more than theaters of combat. They became laboratories of cruelty. Behind the scenes, a group of men called the bestiarii made sure the audience never left disappointed. They were not simple trainers. They managed, bred, and prepared the wild animals brought in from every corner of the empire. But their job was not as simple as it sounded. Wild creatures do not naturally charge at humans, let alone perform before 100,000 screaming spectators. Lions, tigers, and bears instinctively avoided people.
The dangerous things that are going on down here, and it's not just humans fighting against each other, it's humans fighting against animals. They may have wild animals racing around.
Yet failure was not an option. A bestiarius who disappointed the editor in charge could end up facing the same fate as the condemned prisoners. That threat pushed them to create methods that stripped animals of hesitation and turned them into tools of slaughter. Arena-born animals were often fed a diet made up only of human flesh. Stronger beasts were carefully bred, while weaker ones were thrown into the sand to be killed as disposable warm-ups. It was not just the animals who were trained. Those condemned to die were not left unprepared. The bestiarii instructed prisoners on how to behave in the ring, teaching them movements that would guarantee a quicker death and a better show. Nothing was left to chance, because chance had no place in Rome's theater of blood. This cruelty became an art form. The bestiarii gained reputations for creating executions that shocked even the most hardened Romans. As their influence grew, they were trusted to design ever more ambitious midday performances. The ludi meridiani, once a time reserved for executions, became showcases of twisted creativity. By then, arenas were so massive that some could hold 250,000 people, each one hungry for a fresh display of blood. But why did Rome allow things to spiral this far? The answer lies in its rulers. As the empire expanded, so did the egos of those in power. A vain or unstable emperor could command spectacles designed not only to impress, but also to terrify. The more deranged the ruler, the more grotesque the entertainment became. The bestiarii were perfect allies in this pursuit, turning cruelty into theater. So, when we think of Rome's glory, should we not also ask, how far is too far when entertainment demands the destruction of both man and beast? Prisoners and beasts. Spectacle and cruelty were never far apart in Rome's grand arenas, but there came a point when the entertainment crossed into something far more disturbing. By then, damnatio et bestias, the execution of criminals and enemies by wild animals.
He's saying things like he wants to be torn apart by the wild beasts. He wants to be ground like bread between the teeth of the lion.
Had become one of the most anticipated parts of the games. The bestiarii had to continuously invent new methods of execution to satisfy a crowd that demanded novelty. The more elaborate the death, the more applause it received. It was not enough to release a lion or bear into the arena. Audiences expected elaborate setups, shocking twists, and a steady stream of victims. To keep the audience engaged, prisoners were tied to stakes, bound to crosses, or wheeled out on platforms. Some were lashed to boxes that looked secure, but at a signal the structures collapsed, dropping the helpless victims straight into the path of starving animals. Before the carnage began, the crowd was often encouraged to place bets on who would be devoured first. It was not just execution anymore. It was gambling with human lives as stakes. Emperor Caligula pushed this cruelty even further. According to the historian Suetonius, he sentenced men to death without even reviewing their charges. He simply ordered them to be taken away, saying that prisoners should be fed to the animals. Caligula had once diverted funds meant to feed both prisoners and beasts, using the money instead for building temples in his own honor. To solve the problem of hungry animals, he commanded that Rome's prisoners be slaughtered to fill their bellies. It was cruelty disguised as practicality, carried out in front of cheering crowds. But the bestiarii were not only tasked with death, they also recreated myths and legends in grotesque detail. One of the most challenging spectacles involved training an eagle to tear at the organs of a condemned man, echoing the fate of Prometheus. Months of preparation went into such shows, all for a single shocking moment of violence. The horrors became so well known that some prisoners chose death by their own hands rather than face the arena. Seneca wrote of a German captive who avoided execution by ramming a communal lavatory sponge down his throat. Another prisoner, refusing to walk, was forced onto a cart. Once inside the arena, he thrust his head between the spokes of the wheel, breaking his own neck before the animals could be released. By the height of the empire, the halftime shows of damnatio et bestias had become as popular as the main events. People came not only for gladiators, but also to witness cruelty that tested the limits of imagination. It was more than punishment. It was a reflection of Rome's hunger for domination, a hunger that demanded life itself be sacrificed for applause. Human torches of the Colosseum. There are moments in Roman history when the line between entertainment and cruelty nearly disappears. Imagine walking into an arena not to see a contest of strength or skill, but to watch human beings turned into living fire. The condemned were forced into what the Romans called the tunica molesta, a garment soaked in pitch. Once fastened tightly to the body, it was set ablaze. The condemned had no chance of survival. Some were made to play the role of Mucius Scaevola, a legendary figure remembered for proving loyalty to Rome by holding his hand in fire. But in the arena, the performance was twisted into a grotesque parody. The person engulfed in flames might have been framed as a hero, but the crowd cared little for honor. Their screams rose into the air, often drowned out by cheers and applause. Writers who lived under Roman rule did not hold back their disgust. Tertullian, a Christian thinker, described how men were bound to posts, set alight, and mocked as if they were part of a stage play. He said victims were branded as kindling men, torches for the amusement of the masses. In his words, pain itself was made into theater. The cruelty went further than just killing. It was carefully staged, a ritual meant to convey power. Rome wanted its people to see death not only as punishment, but as something with divine meaning. By reenacting myths through suffering, the state turned execution into a symbolic act. It was not about justice, it was about control. Think about the impact of such scenes. The burning of a man was not random violence. It was dressed up as religion, cloaked as history, even paraded as morality. By linking human agony to the legends of gods and heroes, the Romans made every death a form of theater. For the spectators, it was less about who the victim really was, and more about the idea being forced upon them. And what did this achieve? It gave the public a sense of order, a belief that power rested firmly in the hands of those who ruled. Blood spilled on sand, flames rising into the night, and cries swallowed by the roar of a crowd, all became part of a spectacle that combined politics, myth, and punishment into one. There is a disturbing brilliance to how the Romans staged such events. Executions were not hidden away. They were displayed as grand performances where myth and reality collided. The effect was chilling. The arena was transformed into a place where death became a reflection of divine wrath, where the victim's suffering was not a tragedy, but a lesson in obedience. The naumachia. Crowds in ancient Rome expected to be amazed, and sometimes the empire went to great lengths to deliver. If you have watched Gladiator II, you might have wondered whether the Romans truly flooded their amphitheaters to stage naval battles. The surprising truth is that they did, and what unfolded was both astonishing and horrifying. These events, known as naumachiae, were mock sea battles designed to look and feel like real war. Roman engineers reshaped land itself, digging vast basins or even draining lakes so that ships could sail in front of an audience. The scale was unlike anything else the empire had ever staged. The first great naumachia took place in 46 BC. It was ordered by Julius Caesar to celebrate his victories in Gaul and Egypt. He had just returned to Rome in triumph and wanted a spectacle that would cement his power in the minds of the people. Near the Tiber River, a lake was excavated. There, two fleets were assembled, one representing the Tyrians and the other the Egyptians. These were not symbolic crews. They were real men, condemned prisoners forced to fight without any chance of survival. The ships were armed, the weapons sharp, and the combat lethal. Ancient records suggest that as many as 3,000 men took part, along with 12 Roman galleys, turning the water into a battlefield before thousands of spectators who traveled from all over Italy. The idea did not die with Caesar. His heir, Augustus, took it further. In 2 BC, he ordered the construction of an enormous artificial basin measuring 1,800 by 1,200 Roman feet. To keep such a structure supplied, he even commissioned a new aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, built specifically to fill it. On those waters, 30 full-sized warships clashed. Each vessel was manned by criminals and prisoners, numbering again in the thousands, forced to fight to the death. The cruelty of these events lay not only in the killing, but in the sheer hopelessness. These men were not gladiators with a chance to earn fame or freedom. They were expendable, fighting wars that meant nothing to them, staged to glorify an emperor's triumph. The audience roared, thrilled by the sight of fleets colliding, but for the men in the water, it was a sentence carried out under the guise of entertainment. The tradition reached another peak under Emperor Claudius. In AD 52, he decided that an artificial pool was not enough. Instead, he drained Lake Fucine, a natural mountain lake, and staged a naumachia on its surface. Before the fighting began, the condemned saluted him with words that became legend. "Those who were about to die salute you." Whether those words were scripted or cried out in desperation, they captured the essence of what the naumachia had become. Men acknowledged their fate openly, their voices rising across waters soon to be stained red. Each spectacle was carefully crafted to represent historical or legendary conflicts. Caesar's show staged Egyptians against Tyrians. Augustus arranged battles between Persians and Athenians. Claudius chose Sicilians against Rhodians. On the surface, it was a lesson in history and myth. In reality, it was state-sponsored slaughter. The naumachia demanded more resources than any other form of Roman entertainment. They required massive engineering projects, fleets of ships, and thousands of condemned lives. This is why they were not regular occurrences. They were staged only for the most exceptional moments, such as the emperor's victories or major public celebrations. The Colosseum's deadly naval games. By the time the Colosseum was unveiled under Emperor Titus, the idea of turning water into a stage had already become tied to imperial display. To mark the new arena's opening, Titus ordered the massive structure to be flooded. Special flat-bottomed ships were brought in so they could glide over the water. And soon a staged clash between Athens and Syracuse unfolded before tens of thousands of spectators. An artificial island was even constructed in the middle of the arena, where fighters leapt ashore and battled face to face. What must it have felt like to stand in the crowd and see a naval war recreated within the very heart of Rome? The screams, the crashing of oars, and the clash of steel echoed through the amphitheater, with the crowd cheering on. The tradition did not end with Titus. His successor Domitian is believed to have continued these maritime displays inside the Colosseum, ensuring that the public never forgot the sheer power of the empire that could bend land and water alike to its will. By the time of Trajan, nearly a century after Julius Caesar's first staged sea battle, the hunger for these shows had not faded. In the year 109 AD, he ordered the construction of the Naumachia Vaticana, a massive basin near Vatican Hill, where yet another naval spectacle was unleashed. Once again, ships and men were forced into combat until blood stained the water. Each of these naumachiae was more than entertainment. They were carefully staged rituals of control. Rome demonstrated that it could command not only men and armies, but the very elements. In transforming war into performance, the empire was declaring its dominance as absolute, even when the cost was countless human lives. The arena of speed and suffering. The roar of the Roman crowd was never louder than when the chariots took to the track. Long before the Colosseum became the stage for gladiators, the Circus Maximus stood as the empire's true arena of chaos. It was vast, stretching between the Aventine and Palatine hills, and capable of holding more than 150,000 people. Imagine the scale of that. Entire cities in the ancient world were smaller, yet here, Romans gathered shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the thunder of hooves. Unlike gladiatorial combat, where one could expect blood, the thrill here came from something else. It came from speed, rivalry, and the danger that hung over every lap. Chariot racing was more than a game. It was a lifelong devotion. Spectators were not just casual fans, but die-hard followers of their chosen team. The factions were so deeply rooted that loyalty often passed from one generation to the next. Some supported the Blues, while others the Greens, and the tension between them was fierce enough to spill into violence outside the track. But loyalty came at a cost. The wealth behind each team determined everything. Wealthy backers could purchase the best horses, hire the fastest drivers, and give their side an advantage. It was a competition not just of speed, but of power and money. And when the races began, every eye was fixed on the sharp turns of the spina, which was the central barrier dividing the track. Those turns were deadly. The drivers leaned dangerously into them, wheels scraping close enough to splinter. One wrong move could send a chariot flying into the barrier, and this often causes wood to splinter, crushing man and horse beneath it. Accidents were not the exception. They were expected. The Romans even had a word for such crashes, naufragia, meaning shipwrecks, as if the track itself were a raging sea where men sank and were swallowed. The danger only added to the spectacle. A driver who fell risked being caught in his reins. If that happened, he would be dragged violently across the track by his own team of horses. His body would thud against the ground until life was beaten out of him. And still, the race would continue. The crowd cheered, as if the tragedy unfolding before their eyes was part of the entertainment. Horses, too, met grim ends. Some collapsed mid-race or collided into one another in a blur of dust and screams. Why did the Romans keep coming back? Perhaps it was the speed, perhaps the noise, or perhaps it was the mix of triumph and tragedy that made every race unforgettable. For all the danger, the Circus Maximus remained the beating heart of Roman entertainment, and it was proof that their appetite for spectacle extended far beyond the arena of gladiators. The brutal legacy of Rome's arenas. The Colosseum stood as more than just an arena of stone. It was a place where the Roman Empire displayed both its power and its control over the masses. Inside those walls, blood and spectacle came together in a way that entertained, united, and at times divided the crowd. Seating was carefully arranged by class. The elite sat closest to the action, while the poor and powerless were pushed to the highest rows. Even in leisure, Rome never let anyone forget their place in society. But the amphitheater was also designed to stir a sense of belonging. Thousands of people sat side by side, and they reacted as one to every swing of a sword or cry of pain. It created unity, but it was a unity built on watching others suffer. And sometimes, that same intensity spilled over into violence beyond the arena floor. One of the most striking episodes happened during the reign of Emperor Honorius. A Christian monk named Telemachus rushed down from the stands into the middle of a gladiator fight. He raised his hands and tried to separate the fighters, begging for an end to the killing. Instead of cheering him, the crowd turned hostile. He was stoned, and soon he lay dead on the ground. Accounts suggest that this shocking moment influenced the emperor to put a stop to gladiatorial contests altogether. They were outlawed after centuries of bloodshed. Yet it leaves a haunting question. How could a plea for peace be met with such savage rage? In Pompeii, another scene of brutality showed how easily sport could ignite chaos. Visitors from the nearby town of Nuceria had come to watch a contest, but tensions quickly flared with the local crowd. Insults became fists, fists became blades, and before long, the fight grew into a full riot that spread through the streets. The scale of the violence was so great that it was later immortalized in a wall painting, which captured the day when games descended into open warfare. As punishment, the emperor banned all gladiatorial shows in Pompeii for several years. The message was clear. Even entertainment could threaten the empire's order if left unchecked. At its core, the Roman arena was never just about sport. It was about domination. The men and women forced into battle were stripped of identity and turned into objects of amusement. Romans convinced themselves that the suffering of slaves, prisoners, and outsiders was deserved, and that their deaths meant little compared to the thrill of the crowd. By cheering for pain, spectators reinforced the idea that their own lives carried more worth than those beneath them. The arenas stood as mirrors of cruelty and control. They were stages where violence became normal, where compassion was silenced, and where Rome's hunger for power played out in blood. If this glimpse into Rome's darkest spectacles kept you hooked, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.